Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me Daniel McAdams, who's with me almost every week to talk about geopolitics and what is really going on behind the scenes as opposed to what our propaganda machinery is giving us. The news they're giving us, which is bought and paid for, I believe, largely by the military-industrial complex. Welcome, Daniel. It's good to have you back with me again.
Thanks so much, Jay. It's great to join you again.
You know, it's great to have you here, but honestly, the stuff we have to talk about does not make me happy. We have to talk about people killing each other and conniving to take away property from one another, and the lack of respect for sovereign governments and sovereign nations. The desire on the part of mankind, almost I think in a satanic form, to take from others without earning it, and it's just. It makes me sad, but I think I've always believed that we're better off knowing what is happening and dealing with reality than to try to ignore it. And I think probably it's like anybody who's breaking into a house at night, they really don't want the floodlights to come on while they're breaking in, right? So I think what you're doing here is really great, because I think you're revealing a lot of information that most Americans don't have or choose not to have. So I really thank you for coming on. But what I want to talk to you about today, or ask you to talk to us about and fill us in on what's going on in the Ukraine now with the referendum that's taking place in the eastern Ukraine. I guess there are two different geographical or geopolitical divisions within eastern Ukraine that are issuing this referendum today. Tell our listeners, what's this referendum all about?
Well, it's two of the areas in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, have decided to hold a referendum as to whether they should become independent republics. Mm-hmm. They no longer want to be part of Ukraine, and so they held a referendum today. They held a referendum on Sunday, and from everything we've seen, they had a high turnout and a very large vote in favor of breaking away from Ukraine and becoming independent. Now, obviously, in a situation like this where you have military firing on civilians, when you have unrest, when you have people who don't recognize the authority of the central government, which is the case with the East, elections are extraordinarily problematic. So we have to see that coming. But I think they were looking for a way to legitimize what many of the population is feeling, which is that they simply are not happy that the government in Kiev that seeks to rule over them was not elected and came to power as a result of a coup, and especially a Western and U.S.-backed coup. So it doesn't seem that difficult, for me at least, to imagine how we would feel if that happened to us, and whether or not we would recognize the legitimacy of such a government. So it's understandable that they're irritated, and when you pile on that the fact that the government in Kiev is using the military, and it's not even the proper Ukrainian military, because most of those soldiers have either defected to the other side or they've just simply laid down their weapons. So what they've had to do is put together this National Guard, which, I mean, it's very simple to look at some of these photos and see what types of people they are. They're the same kind of violence-crazed people that you saw in Kiev overthrowing the government. They're extraordinarily violent. They've killed dozens of unarmed civilians so far. So you have the situation, very, very tense, and people, every time an unarmed civilian is killed, you probably recruit 10 or 15 people at least to the side of the rebellion, or whatever you call it.
Sure.
So it's
Sure. So what you're saying is the Kiev government, which was put in place, the existing ruler was put in place by the United States, or by alliances to the Europe and the United States, essentially, right?
Yes.
Put into place, and a guy who has had at least a group of people that are very, very strongly fascist or right-wing extremists, I guess you could say.
Yeah, you'd say extreme nationalist.
Right. So now, as I understand it, Daniel, the eastern provinces, Lugansk and Donetsk, how do you pronounce?
Yeah, Donetsk. Yeah.
Donetsk, that they are largely made up of Russian-speaking people, or the majority of people are Russian-speaking, and one of the issues they would like to see is Russian being their language.
Well, that's one of the things that irritated them early on. The first thing that the that the U.S.-backed coup did was cancel Russian as an official language. And when you have, an enormous percentage of the population, or significant, I should say, percentage of the population speaking it, that really is an attack at the heart of a segment of the population. So that's what originally sparked the rebellion, is the new government in Kiev, put in place by the U.S. and the EU, canceling their ability to use Russian. So that is irritating to them. And if you look at the voting patterns in eastern Ukraine, you'll find that they do overwhelmingly support candidates that have been closer to Russia. They voted something, 80% for Yanukovych, who was deposed. So it shouldn't be a surprise to the U.S. that these people aren't happy with the government put in place.
Right.
It's almost like they believe their own propaganda at the State Department, that Ukraine is this singular entity where everyone wants to be a centralized government, and then when something that comes outside of their imaginary view of what it's like, they simply can't accept it. And they turn it on its head. The State Department said yesterday that we condemn the referendum in the East conducted by, quote, armed separatist groups. But look at the videos. Unfortunately, I looked at about 10 or 15 of them over the weekend, and every one that I saw showed individuals who were simply protesting. One of them threw a plastic Coke bottle at a building full of cops, and the cops came out and they shot a couple of people. I saw a kid who didn't look 20 years old laying there dead. Very, very, very troubling.
For the threat of throwing a Coke bottle or something.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, they're not armed. They're so desperate they're throwing a Coke bottle.
Yeah.
So the U.S. is turning it on its head, saying these are illegal. You're not allowed to vote. You can't do it.
Okay, Daniel, I thought that World War I was fought to make the world safe for democracy. I think it was part of the slogan. we supposedly fought World War II to get rid of the evil anti-democratic forces in the world. And yet it's my understanding that Washington is, without even considering it, is just saying we're not going to pay any attention to the will of the people in eastern Ukraine. We don't. It's an illegitimate election. We don't see the right, and I guess what they're doing is relying on the Constitution of the Ukraine or whatever.
But they didn't rely on the Constitution back in February, because there's a specific process for impeaching a president, and it was not followed. The U.S. simply ignored the Constitution in that case, so it's very selective.
Right.
But I mean, we should clarify what we're talking about is the U.S. government, not the United States.
Right, not the people, not you and not me.
Exactly. So when we're critical of it, we're critical of the people who are conducting the foreign policy of the U.S.
Of course.
So it's not unpatriotic. It's actually very patriotic to criticize people who are putting us at great risk.
Yeah. Well, that's our Constitution. That's an idea that flowed from our Constitution. In fact, when our government becomes oppressive, we have not only the right but the obligation to stand up against it and to protest and even overthrow when times get is severe enough. And I guess that's what these people are doing. I thought that's what our country stood for, but clearly it doesn't any longer, unfortunately. And I know, I know there's an excellent article. I was just telling my listeners, there's always a lot of great articles up there on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. But one that Daniel, you wrote here on Friday, in fact, the Ukraine military attacks anti-coup civilians. The U.S. is silent about it. So we just choose to accept the Constitution when it suits. When I say we, our policymakers they choose to accept the Constitution when it suits their purposes, but ignore it otherwise, I guess.
Yeah, and everyone sees this. It's very obvious. The U.S. embraced a violent coup in Kiev and said it was the people speaking. And then when there was a reaction and people in the East were protesting, the U.S. said that they are terrorists. They're Russian stooges, and so the Kiev government started shooting them and killing them. And this horrible U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, who Salon magazine, to their credit, called her a brazen hypocrite. She said this response, using the military to kill unarmed civilians, is a proportionate response. It's reasonable and proportional.
Wow. Oh, that's really warped. I have to think that's just incredible. You say, Daniel, it's obvious. It's obvious to people who look at this with an open mind. it's not obvious to Americans, because I dare say that if I were to walk down the streets of New York and ask most Americans, they would just simply think that what they see on the mainstream media here is the correct story. You know,
Yeah.
how dare you question our American media? We don't lie. Izvestia and Pravda do, but we don't.
And yeah,
So
and they reduce it to the simplest thing. It's all about Putin. It's all about Putin.
it's all about Putin, right?
Well, what's interesting is that the U.S. told Putin, you've got to get these people to stop this referendum in the East. And Putin surprised them and said, okay, guys in the East, you shouldn't do this. It's not a good idea. You should stop it.
Yeah, let's give a chance for some discussions and dialogues here instead of violence.
He did what the U.S. said. He said, call off the referendum. The people in eastern Ukraine said, no, we're going to do it anyway.
Right.
And then the U.S. said, we're going to have additional sanctions on Russia because they didn't stop them.
And if Russia goes in to forcibly stop them, we would go against Russia for that purpose.
Well,
I mean, we would say that Russia has no right to go into the eastern Ukraine. And that would give us an excuse to go in. I mean, there's no way Putin can win on this thing.
No.
In at least as far as the United States, they don't want him to win. They don't want to have any sort of a solution, a peaceful solution. It seems to me. Daniel, we just have a couple of minutes here yet, but I want to ask you, how important is the Ukraine to the overall economy? I mean, is the eastern Ukraine to the overall economy? I understand it's the industrial sort of section of the Ukraine. Is that right? And how important would the Ukraine be to Russia and its trade with Russia?
Well, the eastern part of Ukraine is indeed the industrial part. It's always had a better economy because of trade with Russia. Russia, uses these factories in eastern Ukraine to trade. Ukraine manufactures components also for the Russian military industrial complex. So there are more jobs. The West is more impoverished by a long shot. So it wasn't rocket science to realize that the people in the East wanted to maintain a relationship with Russia because Russia is the one that bought all their stuff.
Right. Well, this is really interesting. And so if you take away, if this is split off from the Ukraine doesn't have much left, I guess.
They have an open hand left.
Yeah, an open hand to the West, and the West is not very generous in what it looks to give to Ukraine or to anybody else as far as that goes. Do you think, Daniel, that let's say this plays out now, and as you anticipated, that it will be strongly in favor of breaking away from the Ukraine, and of course the United States will raise hell about it. What do you think will happen? Are we getting closer to some sort of a conflict, an armed conflict? It would be civil war. What's going to happen here?
I mean, maybe I'm going wacko on conspiracy, but I from everything I see, it looks like the U.S. and the EU side is trying to provoke Russia to get itself involved in Ukraine. That's the only way I can read it. You saw, and interestingly enough, there have been 2 reports in the last week and a half from the German press about CIA covert operators in Ukraine. And today there were several reports of mercenaries from Academy, the former Blackwater, who apparently are involved. So it makes me wonder if German intelligence is trying to head off what they see as a disaster that's being perpetrated by the U.S. and trying to draw Russia into a war on Ukrainian soil. Mm-hmm. So there are so many factors at play under the surface that's very difficult to see that, it's almost impossible to get a handle on it completely.
Mm-hmm. Well, whatever it is, it's not good when people want to have war instead of peace. It just is not a good scenario. And on top of that, we heard earlier today on this show one of our guests, primarily Larry Edelson of the Weiss Group, who tracks war cycles, and every 53 years or so there is a cycle, and we've bottomed out, and we're heading into an increase in the war cycles, which seem to be sort of a repetitious pattern in human behavior, unfortunately. So this is not what we want to hear, Daniel, but as we always say on this show, we want to try to understand and know what reality is so we can best deal with it. So I want to thank you very much for sharing your insights once again with us on Ukraine and other geopolitical actions that are going on around the world. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to talking to you again next week.
Thank you, Jay.